Hola chicos, hoy nosotros vamos a hablar sobre Nueva
Okay.
España.
Thank you for the Spanish. So my name's Luisa, his name's Luca, and we're going to talk about New Spain's movement for independence. So we're going to talk about the causes, the movement itself, and the effects of independence in New Spain.
So what was New Spain exactly? New Spain was one of the many viceroyalties under Spanish control in the Americas. Right? Just think of a viceroyalty as a territory that's under the influence, under the control of the Spanish in this case. Right? So New Spain included the Caribbean, it included Central America, and it included modern day Mexico. Right? The capital of New Spain was Mexico City. And for the purpose of this presentation, the independence movement we're going to talk about will be the Mexican War for Independence.
Okay, now that New Spain has been contextualized, let's get to the nitty-gritty details of the causes.
In the 1700s, the Bourbons replaced the Habsburgs as the ruling monarchy in Spain. This new dynasty sought to modernize Spain, and by doing so, they wanted to modernize its viceroyalties. Under the rule of Charles III, José de Galvez was sent in 1765 to the viceroyalty of New Spain to observe it. There, he noticed that New Spain was very disorganized and went back to Spain, telling Charles III that the laws had to change. In this case, the Bourbon reforms were drafted. The Bourbon reforms sought to increase Spain's incomes from the viceroyalty of New Spain, and they changed a lot in the colony. The Bourbon reforms largely attacked the church. It limited its power. It tried to make education more secularized in America. It limited the privileges of the members of the clergy in America. Overall, it affected religious people in America. It also expelled many Jesuits from America. If one were to separate this into social ranks, one could definitely say that the Bourbon reforms mostly affected the Creoles. It is not a coincidence that one of the major leaders of the Mexican War for Independence was indeed a Creole and a priest. His name was Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla. We will talk about him shortly. The Bourbon reforms also tried to control trade in America. By doing so, they angered many merchants. They lost their freedom of trade, and also they thought that the money that the Spanish were taxing from them were not being reinvested in the colony. In 1796, the Spanish went to war against the British. Now, what effect did this have exactly on the colonies of Spain? The war with the British was increasingly negative for the Spanish. First, it increased its fiscal demands by requiring extra funds from the churches in its colonies. And also, it was the cause of a blockade imposed by the British in the colonies. This blockade allowed for the colonies themselves to engage in free trade with neutral countries. In 1808, the news that Napoleon had captured Charles IV and Ferdinand VII reached New Spain. This event proved an opportunity for people in Spain to strike a blow for self-rule. The Creoles were the first to strike. The Mexico City Cabildo organized an assembly that featured many elitists from very different groups. These people would govern New Spain until Ferdinand VII would return. The Creole movement for home rule was largely opposed by the Peninsulares that also resided in New Spain. These Peninsulares really needed this relationship, this close commerce with Spain, as they largely benefited from it. Seeing that the Creoles were trying to depose the Spanish, or maybe trying to attain home rule, these Peninsulares decided to strike back. On September 15, 1808, these Peninsulares ousted Viceroy Turaguay and arrested many Creoles that supported this movement for autonomy. This changed forever the leaders of the Creole movement for home autonomy. The leadership of the Creole movement now passed on to the marginal elites. The people that represented the marginal elites lived in a barrio. A barrio was a region that has as its inhabitants upper-class individuals with modest economic backgrounds. The special social and economic background of the barrio were very decisive in the early stages for the Mexican Revolution of Independence. Due to its very complex industrial and agricultural structures at the time, the barrio was considered the most modern region of all Mexican regions. Some might even go as far as to say that the barrio had a quasi-capitalist structure, meaning that it was semi-capitalist. By the late 18th century, the working conditions and the living conditions of workers at barrios had been diminished by a lot. These social tensions were only aggravated in 1808 and 1809 when drought and famine struck the barrio. It was because of these social tensions that the Mexican struggle for independence began.
The founder and leader, and probably the most prominent name of the Mexican independence movement, is Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla. Costilla was a Criollo Roman Catholic who fostered in his religious gatherings the idea of a commotion, led by the Criollos, the Mestizos, the Zambos, and the American Indians, peasants, against the wealthy Spanish landowners and foreign aristocrats. An initiative that later granted him the name the Father of the Mexicans. During his 7 years at his hometown in Dolores, Hidalgo and Costilla and several others like him, Criollos, Peninsulares, American Indians, Mestizos, Zambos, and Mulattoes, participated in these organized secret discussion groups led by Costilla. Under such chambers, the independence movement was founded over these informal meetings directed against the Spanish colonial government. When in 1810 a foremost reporter betrayed the conspirators, Hidalgo and Costilla declared war against the colonial government. At dawn of September 16, the day now considered Mexico's Independence Day, the Revolutionary Army decided to strike for independence and march on the Guanajuato, and the famous El Grito de Dolores marked the beginning of the fight for Mexican independence. In Guanajuato, the rebel army seized control of the warehouse on September 28, and most of the Spaniards were either annihilated or expelled. On October 30, 1810, Hidalgo and Costilla's army encountered the Spanish resistance on the Battle of Monte de las Cruces and won them over, but the rebels failed to defeat the large and heavily armed Spanish army in Mexico City. In January 1811, Spanish forces fought the Battle of Bridge of Calderon and defeated the insurgent army, forcing the rebels to flee towards the United States-Mexican border, where they hoped to escape. However, they were intercepted by the Spanish army, and Hidalgo and Costilla and the rest of the soldiers were captured in the region now known as Los Altos. Hidalgo faced court trial of the Inquisition and was found guilty of treason. He was executed by a fighting squad in Chihuahua on July 31, 1811. His body was mutilated and his head displayed in Guanajuato as a warning to the rebels. Following the death of Hidalgo and Costilla, the leadership of the Revolutionary Army was assumed by José María Morelos, also a priest. Coincidence? Don't think so. But under his leadership, the cities of Oaxaca and Acapulco were occupied. In 1813, the Congress of Chilpancingo was convened, and in November 6 of that same year, the Congress signed the first official document of independence, known as the Solemn Act of the Declaration of Independence of Northern America. It was followed by a long period of war at the siege of Cuautla. In 1815, Morelos was captured by Spanish colonial authorities and executed for treason in San Cristobal on December 22. The story again.
From 1815 to 1821, the Mexican War for Independence was largely fought under the guerrilla warfare style. Under the guerrilla warfare style, the soldiers were led by Guadalupe Victoria and Vicente Guerrero. The Spanish viceroy, however, thought that this situation was very much under control and would offer a pardon to any soldier that would surrender against the fight. Those part of the rebel army faced heavy Spanish military defense. The biggest defense from the Spanish military, one could say, came in December of 1820. This event was to be, at least in the eyes of the Spanish, the last war effort against the rebels. This event was supposed to put a strike to end all of it. The military officer that was sent to fight against Guerrero in this case was Agustín de Iturbide. He was one of the best military officers.
Iturbide's campaign to the Oaxacan region coincided with a successful military coup d'etat in Spain against the new monarchy of King Ferdinand VII, who had just returned to power after being imprisoned by Napoleon I of France after he invaded Spain in 1808. The coup leaders, who had been assembled on expeditionary forces to suppress the Mexican independence movement, forced the unenthusiastic King Ferdinand VII to sign a liberal Spanish constitution. When news of the liberal charter reached Mexico, Iturbide saw it as a double threat to the status quo and to his own power, now at the mercy of Creoles. Ironically enough, independence was finally achieved when forces in colonies chose to rise up against a temporarily liberal regime in Spain. After an initial clash with Guerrero's army, Iturbide switched alliances and invited the rebel leader to meet and discuss principles of a renewed independence struggle. While stationed in the town of Iguala, Iturbide proclaimed 3 principles of guarantees for Mexico's independence from Spain. The document, known as the Plan de Iguala, declared that Mexico would be independent. Its religion was to be Roman Catholicism, and its inhabitants would be united, without distinction of race, between Mexican and Europeans. It stipulated further that Mexico would become a constitutional monarchy under King Ferdinand VII, he or some Spanish or other European king who could occupy the throne in Mexico City. The plan was so broadly based that it pleased both patriots and loyalists. The goal of independence and protection of Roman Catholicism brought together all factions. In the ending conflict of the war, Iturbide's army was joined by rebel forces from all over Mexico. When the rebels' victory became certain, the Viceroy of New Spain resigned. On August 24, 1821, representatives of the Spanish crown and Iturbide signed the Treaty of Cordoba, which recognized Mexican independence under the terms of the Plan of Iguala, ending 3 centuries of Spanish colonial rule. During the struggle for independence, Mexico lost 1/10 of its citizens. In the decade following separation from Spanish rule, Mexico saw a drastic decline in its gross domestic product and the amount of foreign trade. The war did not only have a rough start, it also costed a lot of money for the Mexican banks. The war officially ended in 1821, and independence was a dream come true, except for the generalized impoverishment and devastation that scarred the country for generations to come. During the war effort, agricultural, mining, and industrialized production completely disappeared, and more than 500,000 Mexicans died. Under this light, Mexico now endured the hardships of being an independent state. This struggle marked the transition from a Spanish colony to an underdeveloped nation. For the succeeding next 30 years, Mexico had 50 governments derived almost exclusively from military coups. Out of the 50, 11 were presided by General Antonio López de Santa Anna. This was a complicated century indeed, stifled by change and despair. In the political stage, Mexico was divided between the liberals and the conservatives. As in America, these 2 groups disagreed for their pastimes, whereas the conservatives wished to maintain the principles of the old Spain's monarchy's parameter of ruling, the liberals sought a federal republic system within the United States models. Oh yes, America. Thereby, one could foresee that education, work, religion, government, and what else there is to matter was a matter of heated debate. Indeed, they disagreed over almost everything. In the year of 1833, General Lopez came to the political scene of Mexico. Even though he was a fairly good president, like all of them are, the territory of Mexico was way too big for him to impose and reinforce laws effectively. More to the end of war, Santa Anna signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, in which Mexico would sell more than half of its territory, including present-day Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and Texas, to the United States. Booyah! But this would turn out to be the dire mistake for Mexico, since these territories were rich in potential economic flourish, including rich soil and mining opportunities. to the Mexicans.